Thanks very much, everybody, for going to your breakout rooms, and hopefully you had a good conversation. It'd be good to hear about conversations in different breakout groups. Each breakout group had a chair and a rapporteur. So I'll start off with group one, which I was in that group one, and ably chaired by Eddie Blair, and Charlotte Summers was the rapporteur. So I'll hand over to you, Charlotte, to report, and then Eddie, if there's anything else you want to add.
Thank you, Munir. So our question to address was, how do we make progress in long COVID in the presence of such uncertainty? And so one of the things that we thought is that there are several areas that we probably need to address research-wise. Firstly, there's some questions outstanding around the impact of different variants and viral loads on the impact of long COVID. But also we felt that we need better ways of stratifying and impacting kind of patient characteristics, their comorbidities, and so the combination, I guess, of their genome and their exposome on the development of long COVID. And we thought to do that, we probably need a combination of things, including access to patient and samples, but also better tools for both diagnosis and prognosis. But critically, to get any progress, we thought that there needs to be integration between the healthcare delivery system and all types of researchers, so from preclinical through to phase 3, both academic and commercial, because at the moment there's a gap if you're particularly in the commercial sector and you've got an early phase asset that you think might be appropriate for a particular setting in long COVID, trying to find who to talk to and where to make those links is challenging. And then finally, I think we were keen to see that there were support for all stages of research, and that it is going to take an entire pipeline and a multidisciplinary approach to improving outcomes in long COVID, and not just the development of pharmacotherapy. We need a broader, more holistic approach to interventions that might help.
Great, thank you very much. It's a great summary. Eddie, is there anything you want to add?
No, I think that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Charlotte. Two things that I just mentioned is to name check Paul, because we did talk about imaging as one of those diagnostic tools that might help with managing long COVID. And then there was quite a long discussion just to make Kieran aware about how we think there might be a place for patient education or patient helper education as part of the GP funded education piece around long COVID. But other than that, I think I'd just like to thank all the participants for making my job as chair very easy, and particularly to Charlotte for summarising so well.
Thanks, Eddie. Kieran isn't online, but I'll email her and let her know about our discussions.
Thanks, Munir. Great.
Any questions or comments from anybody? Any questions you want to ask? So one of the aspects we did talk about was about brain imaging, and so some of the sort of images you showed, Paul, this morning were quite striking. The PET scan, the hypermetabolism, etc. And obviously these are small numbers that you've undertaken this because it's an expensive technique. Do you know there's many more studies going on to be able to understand what the hypermetabolism actually means, whether it's reversible, whether sort of, there is long-term consequences of that?
There's not that many studies in the UK. There's some studies in US being funded. As a part of the FOSS, there is some of the patients are being followed up, and again, a handful of, or probably a couple of hundred patients. But there's not a huge amount of study happening at this moment, as far as I gather.
And the hypometabolism that occurs, do you think that's going to be reversible?
So I think some of the data coming, and so immediately, probably after 1 month or so after the event, we see some hypermetabolism, and by 6 months, there's some amount is reversible. So I would imagine people with the persistent symptoms are the ones who are having the persistent hypometabolism. The people who are recovering probably are compensating in some ways and getting back to. In the acute phase, which I didn't show, is you also see hypermetabolism. That's probably secondary to the encephalitis or meningitis happening and glial activation and the glucose metabolism going up as a reactive phenomenon. But just to highlight that. But predominantly what we were more worried about is the hypometabolism, and especially if it is persisting.
Okay, thank you. Before we go on to group 2, maybe Charlotte, I don't know whether you want to mention some of the issues you think are there in terms of linking up different studies, different biobanks and so on, some of the governance issues you talked about.
Yes, of course. So one of the key things that I think would probably help in the longer term is that there are lots of discrete data sets and studies, both of biosamples, but also clinical data and trial data, that at the moment regulations make it challenging to join all of those up. There were some discussions around all of the platform studies actually down the line linking, but with the health data concerns that have been in the press recently, all of that has got a little bit harder. And so some coordinated fashion by which, if you happened to be in the principal trial to try and keep you out of hospital, but ended up in hospital and taking part in recovery and then joining FOSP and genomic, being able to look at all of those different aspects of your illness where there's data and your routine health data would be tremendously informative to help us understand more about this disease. But at the moment, the regulations are proving challenging.
Okay, and what's the solution to that, Charlotte?
The solution to that, I think, is probably across regulators, NIHR and HDR UK, finding a way to communicate effectively with the public that this is something that's helpful. I think that's where it went a little bit awry the other week, and that there are positive things that come out of this, that it's not about their data just being sold for commercial purposes, and that there's a real pressing need, and then the regulatory hurdles being taken out of the way because they're stopping progress in healthcare.
Okay, thanks very much, Charlotte. Any comments from anybody before I move on to group 2? Okay, I don't see any hands up. So let's move to group 2. Paul, you chaired it. I don't know who your rapporteur was.
Emmy. Sorry, Emmy's around.
Hi, Paul. Yeah, so we spoke about how we understand individual predisposition to long COVID. We spent an amount of time talking about the still challenges in defining long COVID beyond hospitalized and non-hospitalized, the challenges of the clustering of symptoms and how that relates to dysfunction and so on, and that is tied to how or whether people are predisposed to it, because we need to define the disease first. We in terms of predisposing factors, one of our colleagues mentioned that there's already a review, I think by NICE, which has identified some factors which are now well documented: female gender, obesity, asthma, which seem to be related to a higher risk of persistent symptoms. But beyond that, we identified 2 areas where more results are expected and more work is to be done. One is in Charlotte was alluding to the linkage with NHS data, that in existing platform trials and one of the core funded studies, convalescence, as well as looking at linked data in the NHS going backwards. But also there are cohort studies in that convalescent study where you can compare with pre-pandemic population, because that's a big question, is knowing people's pre-pandemic or pre-COVID comorbidities to compare what the risk factors are. So those discussions about disease definition and definition of premorbid or conditions or comorbid conditions meant that we're still quite far from stratifying. If I was to summarize this, some good news in terms of organ-specific effects where imaging and other modalities may help, and as long as that's linked with the premorbid data. And we spoke particularly about lung fibrosis, about myocarditis, pericarditis, and also about neurological or brain imaging findings, but in relation to brain fog. But yeah, and when finally we spent some time talking about biomarkers and the potential role of omics, and do chip in other members of the group, but I think we felt that we need to do the rest first before we get to the stage where omics is going to inform us. We can't do omics without better disease definition and better definition of the premorbid conditions.
Okay, thank you very much, Ami. Paul?
Yeah, Ami covered everything. Probably I myself threw a question that, can we carry on doing the omics and imaging and stuff for the next 5 years where the patients are knocking at your door and say, we want treatment. So it's sort of that's the challenge we are facing. Yeah, we had a very good discussion over the period. There's nothing else to add.
Yes, that is a challenge, isn't it? Because if patients are knocking on your door for treatment, do you resist saying we don't know and we don't want to give you anything to do, or do you start giving them the kind of hydroxychloroquine type of things that happened in COVID-19 at the beginning of the pandemic? So I think that is a challenge.
And it's also a fine balance, because if we are the patient or if we are the receiving end, we would like some treatment. So it's quite a tricky one.
It is, yes, very much so. Any comments from anybody in the group or anybody in the workshop today? So I in terms of your omics point, Ami, I guess what we need to think about is that samples should be collected and biobanked and archived with linkage to clinical data, so that as we get more information, more knowledge, better knowledge, then whereby we can actually stratify clinically, then that allows us to be able to utilize the samples which are available. Because the problem is that if we only collect samples later on, we may not have enough of a sample size to be able to look at some of the potential genetic predictors or other biomarkers.
I fully agree with that. We're thinking about this in our own study about how much to biobank and how much to analyze and process, and we think definitely we should be biobanking, and as many people as we can consent to it. But in the first instance, we need to come up with the right questions to do the tests.
But in a study like yours, where you've got to have very deep phenotyping with some of the imaging that you're doing at the start, it would be a shame not to have the biobank that you can look at later on, should you know?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, great. Any questions or comments on that one? Okay, well, let's move to group 3. What can we learn from long COVID that we can apply to other diseases? So Shuli, I think you were chairing. I don't know who was.
Yeah, and Belen's going to feed back on.
Okay.
Yes.
Group.
Thank you, Shuli. Okay, so we were talking about 3 main areas. So one is about robustness of data, how do we apply the effects of long-term COVID to other diseases, and the fact also that it's still very early days to draw any firm conclusions. So starting by the last one, so we were talking about, for example, comparing, like in terms of the long-term COVID, it could be shorter or longer. So for instance, in the case of rheumatoid arthritis, you will have different effects if you were to treat this disease in 3 months compared to 6 months. So it's something to bear in mind about this. Then also we discussed the fact that we need to involve patients in clinical trials, and also that we need to look at different groups of ages. On this respect, we know that, okay, so COVID-19 affects predominantly to elderly people, but we must not ignore the pediatrics population because they also suffer from long-term COVID. And by ignoring this group, perhaps we could be jeopardizing their longevity in the long term. Then about the long COVID in applying the findings to other diseases, we were talking about the factors. So for instance, we know that COVID-19 causes multi-organ disease, but this is due to just the one factor, and that is the virus, the COVID-19. However, we were also talking about lupus, which is a multifactorial disease also causing a multi-organ disease. We discussed the clusters, identifying clusters of disease, and then how do we define the disease activity and the targets. We mentioned that, for instance, precision medicine can be useful, but let's not ignore medicines that have a broader action, and that can also be very useful. We also need to agree on the endpoints, and then we need better outcome measures to treat symptoms outside the COVID. So for instance, people with myalgia, fibromyalgia, chronic bowel disease, mental fog, like all these areas. So this group of patients, they've been looking for solutions, and it is now that with the conclusions that we are drawing from the COVID-19 that we can apply the findings to this group of patients. And then we were also talking about the robustness of data. So how are we going to put all this data into a pot? And how can we ensure that is robust? Because yes, there is a lot of information out there. However, it may not be that reliable, and we need to identify as well cohorts and the size of these areas of study. So I think that is about it. I don't know if Shirley wants to add anything else.
Okay, Shirley.
Thank you, Belen, and thank you to the group. I think hearing the other two groups, the sort of the overlapping themes were definitely this robustness of data and linking data sets and really trying to get the full picture. And then the other thing that came across was this learning, really understanding what's going on in the disease, because if we don't really understand the pathophysiology and however we define endpoints, we may be sort of heading off in the wrong direction. So there was a theme about it takes time, and I think that sort of dovetails with what the other groups were saying of, yes, we've done a lot in a short time, but things will take more time still to get that depth of understanding that we need. So thank you. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks to the group.
Any questions for Shirley or Belen? Can I ask one of the things that?
Quick comment, Manir. Brian here.
So can you hear me? Yes, go ahead, please, Brian.
Yeah, but just that thread of the immunoinflammatory angle seems to be running through this quite a lot in everyone's comments, and the allusion to the lupus situation, which is multi-organic and along that way, may also be relevant. Sorry, just to draw attention to it. Yeah.
So I was going to ask Brian in a few minutes for you to be able to give a perspective from the ABPI in terms of today's. So I'll pre-warn you for that. Then I'll bring you back in a few minutes, if that's okay. So Mark, you've got a question or comment?
Yeah, I was just sort of the devil's advocate in the group as a rheumatologist, just trying to, express some caution about over connecting this to lupus. There are some real differences, and there are other diseases with multi-organ pathology that we should also look at. And I mentioned AIDS or HIV is one of them. That's kind of an interesting one, and there are other diseases, that's sarcoidosis and lots of other kind of multi-organ diseases that we should look at. I would caution at sort of just connecting it with lupus, because lupus is a very different beast sometimes. But there are some lessons to be learned from our experience with lupus, which is that it was very, very difficult to get drugs licensed for lupus. And there are a lot of lessons from the trial, the experience that we had in lupus, that the long COVID community should look at. They should sort of try and sort of talk to the lupus world to see what lessons they learned from their bad experiences, not just their good experiences. That's what I would say.
So thanks very much for that, Mark, and you may want to come into this question as well, and Shirley as well. One of the overlaps between long COVID, at least some aspects of long COVID, and other diseases with chronic fatigue syndrome, which we've had known about for a long time. The sort of fatigue, other manifestations, including the kind of lack of concentration and things like that. But we haven't learned very much of that, and there's still a lot of controversy. For example, some guidelines which are coming out from the Royal College, which were going to sort of advocate the use of physical therapies, etc., were sort of are quite controversial, have been held back at the moment, because patients feel that just going for rehabilitation is not the answer for chronic fatigue syndrome, and there may be other things going on. And Kieran Collinson highlighted the need for rehabilitation in long COVID, which may not be particularly well received by patients, in terms of saying, well, actually, you're just telling us to go and do a bit of physio, and that's not going to help us very much. So I know, Shirley, whether you discussed that as part of what we can learn long COVID and CFS particularly.
Yeah, we talked about, we started with thinking about patient and public involvement, and we're very pleased to see the example that the HEAL, what had happened in HEAL and what Charlotte talked about this morning, and saying actually the way that that's been done of defining endpoints and bringing patients and public into the design of that study is a really, really nice example. But yes, then that led on to the question of, okay, if we're putting so much attention onto long COVID, including symptoms such as brain fog and symptoms that in other contexts have not necessarily had the impact in terms of treatments that patients would want, actually, what does that then mean for those patients? And how do we make sure that if we do have relevant scientific or medical, treatment breakthroughs from a long COVID perspective, that we translate them across to those other diseases. So yeah, we did talk about the fact that the patient perspective could be, hang on, if it was labelled long COVID, I'd be getting all this care and potentially treatments down the line, but because it's labelled something else, is that not getting the same attention?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a really important point, because I've had lots of referrals to my clinic for patients who are suffering from fluoroquinolone disability syndrome, which is now recognized by the FDA as a particular adverse effect of fluoroquinolones, which is associated with these kind of fatigue, brain fog, etc. And they're saying, well, there's so much effort going into long COVID, and everybody's forgotten about us, and so on. So, I think there is that issue there. Philippa, you've got your hand up, and then Eddie.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I think it's partly been addressed, but it seemed to me, just listening to this, I a lot of this is about dealing with uncertainty, partly in understanding disease and also in communication to health professionals and to the public. And then also it seems the answer to the uncertainty is in driving the research, which requires public engagement and confidence about supporting data sharing and research. I suppose since long COVID does COVID grabs the attention more than other conditions, which, as we've seen, is a problem as well as a good thing. Is there still scope to capitalise on the sort of public awareness of long COVID to help try and solve some of these healthcare data sharing issues?
Yeah, I think that is correct, and I think people are trying to do that. HDI UK, I know NHS has got a big engagement program going ahead, because without data, we wouldn't be where we are now in terms of fighting long COVID, fighting COVID itself, actually. And the data that comes through for showing vaccine effectiveness, etc., is all data that is, that is anonymized, pseudo-anonymized, etc., for us to be able to use it. If we didn't have access to that data, we would be nowhere in terms of knowing whether everything was working. So yeah, absolutely, very important point. Eddie.
Just a comment to add to what you're saying about related disease, Munir. I think post-sepsis syndrome is a very obvious link to long COVID as well. So that was just a comment. And then the other comment is just to follow up on what Sheila was saying about learning. The learning experience, kind of what Pippa was saying, needs to translate into education, dissemination, and better communication of benefits of participating. So I think that came up in the feedback from our group. I just wanted to emphasise that as something that we felt quite strongly about.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks very much, Eddie. Any final comments on any of the three groups? If not, maybe I should then, Tracy. You're on mute, Tracy. You're on mute.
Well, what have we learned from the chronic fatigue syndrome? You going back to your point and not being very tractable. I think from my experience working in that community quite a lot, it seems there are different causes for the same condition, many different causes, and it's individual to each person. And therefore, is there a different model that's needed to tackle that at a very individual level? That's really all my point.
Absolutely, and I absolutely agree. We can try to treat the population, but actually in the end it comes down to the individual. When I see a patient in my clinic, it's a person sitting in front of me that I have to really try to treat. Yeah, absolutely. David.
Yes, and just following on from that, I think, looking back over my career in clinical medicine, you think of things like idiopathic cardiomyopathy, all the work that was done, or with Harry Keane did, around inflammation of the pancreas, the idiopathitis there, and leading to diabetes. I think there are a number of areas there where COVID-19 has shone the spotlight on them again. I think there'll be new focus on those, and I think there are a lot of learnings. So I think this will go more widely, but certainly I think all that we saw in cardiomyopathy will need us to look again and see, should we be intervening early in some of those viral infections to prevent this and so on?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, if no more points or comments, Brian, maybe I can ask you to say a few words about what you found from the workshop. Why is this important for ABPI, and some of the sort of, we haven't discussed what the long-term action plan should be from this workshop, and then we may need to meet up afterwards, but then I can close the workshop.
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Munir. It's been incredibly informative to me. I think the set of presentations that you put together were really brilliant and pretty well up to the minute, and I certainly learned a lot, and I hope that the sharing of it amongst the community here has helped as well. I think another reflection is that when we talked about designing this 6 months ago or so, we clearly knew there was a lot moving quite quickly, and there's still a lot moving quite quickly. And I hope that the topics that we picked on were still relevant. I think they were from the outputs from the groups. I do think it's kind of still early days. I think there's an awful lot of research happening, and we're trying to sort of second guess stuff a bit when we had our discussions. There's an urgency here that people want to do something. I think some of these trials, you need to run the course and see what the results are before you rush off and do the next thing. It would be a reflection. I think there are some learnings from other disease areas, but Mark's caution not to pin everything on one comparator is important. I do think that thread of immunology and inflammation that we're learning about in all sorts of other disease areas is key to this. And we're learning more about that in other disease areas as well as this one. And the more we can bring those together, I think is going to be important as we go forward. And the last point, I think, and it really was highlighted, you've said it already, but I'll say it again, the way that we corralled data during COVID under the COPI notices really highlighted the value of being able to pull health data for a specific purpose in what was an emergency. And the more we can do that in a safe environment going forward without sort of falling back to the previous situation, the better from a research viewpoint. I think there are challenges clearly with the issues around making sure we take the public with us and engage the public and the patients before we make announcements on things or try and implement things is clear, and we will be hoping to get more involved in that from a public viewpoint going forward across the board, not just for COVID and long COVID. I do think it would be good to reflect on how this workshop's gone, Munir, and see whether we should be taking forward anything specific from this group, and maybe, if nothing else, convening a rerun in a few months' time and seeing whether some of these results of trials that are ongoing are out, and whether we can reflect on anything more specific and more definitive conclusions about the pathophysiology of long COVID, the variety of that, and what you can do about it. So I think that's a reflection from the ABPI. It's fairly general at the moment. We wouldn't be talking about anything specific company-wise or drug-wise, but clearly the industry is keen to be involved in the discussion and wants to help take this forward and help address it going forward. And I think for COVID and long COVID, we should be looking at having therapeutics as well as vaccines. We're going to be working with this for a long time, and that's going to be a good mix if we can get there.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. That's great. So thank you. So I think what I want to do is just close the workshop. Normally, what we try to do at the end of these workshops is produce a paper, which can then be published, but none of us has any time at the moment to write papers, really, with everything going on. But what we may do is to write, an A4 page with some bullet points, which highlight some of the recommendations from this. And so, Brian, maybe we can link up after this workshop and see what those particular recommendations would be. It may be very generic recommendations about data linkages, sorting out the governance issues, having biobankings, which is linked to data, allows more mechanistic assessments, being able to link up to the NHS clinics so that commercial companies as well as academics can access patients and things like that. So there may be some generic issues recommendations we can make from this. As an output from the workshop, and pass on to our colleagues at NIHR, at NHS, UKRI, and various other bodies, including sort of, whoever you need to within ABPI. So I think that may be one of the sort of things that comes out of it as an action plan. But maybe what we can do, Brian, is to link up, after the workshop in a couple of week or two, and see how we can want to take that forward, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so I think that's the end of the workshop. First of all, let me thank the speakers. Fantastic talks. from all the speakers. Really, really insightful, really up to date. And I learned a lot about long COVID today. So, it's really, really helpful. Rather than reading journals, etc., it's been much easier to actually listen to you and learn a lot about what's going on with long COVID. To the chairs and rapporteurs for the breakout groups, thank you very much for your help. You were corralled at short notice to do this, and you did that brilliantly. Thank you. And obviously all the participants who came to the workshop and contributed today. Thank you very much. Great to see all of you, and see you at the next workshop. Thank you, and have a way. I would normally say have a safe trip back home, but you're probably at home, so have a nice cup of tea or something. Thank you.